Turning points change the course of our lives, whether it's a big decision, overcoming an obstacle or tragedy, or taking a leap of faith. These stories of inspiration and resilience are what Turning Point is all about. Hi everyone, great to have you here for another episode of Turning Point. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation with Rebecca Thomas. She is an author, a poet, an award-winning spoken word artist, and an activist for Indigenous rights. Thank you so much for being here, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you are joining us from Halifax today, right?
That is correct.
One of my favorite places in the world. And I know that I'm in Toronto. I know that in terms of the pandemic, things are in a much better place, let's say, there at this point. How are you managing?
Well, today it was announced that we had 0 cases today, new cases. So that's exciting. So I think we're down to 10 for the whole province, which is really lovely. I ate lunch at a restaurant yesterday. It was great.
Oh, wow. That sounds like heaven. I guess I haven't been to a restaurant in almost, it feels like a year. I don't even know now. Time is such a strange thing, but I'm very happy to hear that things are going well there. And hopefully, that I feel like we're on the home stretch now with the vaccine. So hopefully things just continue to progress that way.
Yes, absolutely. I really hope that kind of EU shipping thing gets sorted out for the sake of the rest of the planet.
Yes, me too. Speaking of the Maritimes, this is actually where we first met for the first time, or I should say more so, I met you because I was working at CTV Atlantic at the time. You were the poet laureate in Halifax, so this was in 2016. So I heard a lot of your spoken word performances at some of the events that I was at. I was always so moved by your poetry, and it's really fitting actually because your turning point that we spoke about the other day is how you really came to be a poet. So tell me how that happened. Tell me about this turning point.
Yeah, it would be probably the first time that I kind of started performing on stage with my poetry, but to how I got there came from doing a kind of a creative submission for an assignment, like for a kind of a professional development course that I was in, and I was speaking with another colleague, and we were talking about the similarities between Mi'kmaq people and African Nova Scotians with regards to being kind of very marginalized by our position in society. And she turned me on to Elle Jones, who was the poet laureate before me. And Elle hosted this thing as Word on the Street. And it was just a kind of open house poetry night where they would have a feature in the second half. And I took that poem that I had written, and I brought it up on stage and, very, clutching my notebook very tight with a very dry mouth, and went on stage and did my poem. And it was so very well received. It was certainly kind of a bit of a rush and a little bit of an addictive feeling being, the spotlight in that way. I always joke I have many, many brothers and sisters. I am a middle child through and through. So having any kind of direct attention was always something that I cherished and coveted. And it went really well. And so I wrote another poem and I went to the next event the following month. And then it was after I had done 2 poems that Elle, who was the host, had gone up on stage, and she said, in front of a full bar, I would like to invite Rebecca Thomas to be the feature for next month. And everybody turned to look at me, and I was kind of put on the spot. And I kind of sheepishly took a drink of my beer and nodded, and then I kind of put together some pieces, and I had this 20 minutes of the following month of doing poetry, and people were listening, and they were snapping along and being really into the words that I was saying. And afterwards, people came up and said how impacted they felt, and how I made them look at things in a different way. And so that was the beginning of my kind of poetry career, my performance career, for sure.
And this was about 7 or 8 years ago. So things happened very quickly for you, becoming the poet laureate in Halifax about 3 years after that first time that you got on stage. You mentioned the impact that you have heard from people that your work has had. Tell me, what was that first poem about?
The poem was called Sweetgrass in the City, and it was a little bit of me standing my ground and kind of learning that I can be just as Mi'kmaq, having grown up in like a city or away from a reserve. And I talked a lot about my dad's legacy, how he went to residential school, and he went in speaking only Mi'kmaq and he left speaking only English, and what that means for the generational trauma and the disconnect between parent and child and all that sort of stuff. And it was about me kind of relearning and forging a relationship with my Mi'kmaq community and culture and all that sort of stuff, and almost being slightly indignant at the, like, how dare you say that I am not as Indigenous or Mi'kmaq or whatever that may be. And so the idea, the last line of the poem was like that sweetgrass does grow in the city, like, so you can be connected to your community and your culture without having to be on a reserve. And it was definitely an affirmation for myself to feel confident in who I was. Because I have, even now I still kind of have these bouts of insecurity or imposter syndrome. And so it was very much an affirmation. It's like, no, like, I am Mi'kmaq, the Louisa Rebecca, like, the Leo Jibuktuk Mi'kma'ki. So I may live in Halifax, but I am who I am, and I'm proud of that.
These are very personal and vulnerable topics to be talking about. Your own identity, to talk about your father's experience as a residential school survivor. Was it ever hard to be that vulnerable in front of strangers?
Not when it comes to this stuff. It's very interesting. Like, I can go up and I can talk about how sometimes I wish I looked a little bit different, that I looked more Mi'kmaq, and, my mom's white, so I'm mixed ancestry, all that sort of stuff. I can talk about my, insecurity about not necessarily speaking Mi'kmaq or stumbling over Mi'kmaq words or not knowing like all the history or culture and stuff. And I feel very okay talking about that, because the reason, I don't know these things is because of this very, very long history of assimilation and colonization, and that, I was the desired outcome before I started reconnecting, right? Of things like residential school. We have all these Indigenous people who don't really know much about where they came from. And so I don't feel upset or embarrassed or vulnerable when it comes to that stuff. But what I do feel upset and vulnerable is talking about things like love and anger and sadness and like that kind of desire for connection, whether it be, romantic love or platonic love or whatever that may be. I always found that to be far more embarrassing. I have this poem in my book called Love Is, and so many people have reached out and said that they love that poem. They connected to it. It was one of their favorites. And it was the poem that I was probably the most embarrassed to have in my poetry collection. So much so that when it came to editing that piece, my editor had all these kind of track changes, and I just highlighted the poem and I said, accept all, because I didn't want to have to revisit that poem. So it's interesting where my anxieties and vulnerabilities lie when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, that is very interesting. And I guess we all kind of draw those vulnerabilities from our own personal experiences, and especially when it comes to the relationships we had when we were kids and when we were young. You mentioned there just reconnecting with your Mi'kmaq heritage. And it sounds like that really happened for you as an adult.
Yeah, I had like my childhood was filled with moments of being, in community or, part of ceremony here and there. But it always felt like it wasn't for me. It was for my dad. Like, it took me a long time to understand that I was Mi'kmaq too. Like, I'd be like, oh, well, my dad's Native, right? Like, that's how I used to talk about it, but not recognizing that meant that I was too. And so I remember, trying to learn to smudge for the first time and feeling really nervous, as like the sweetgrass came closer and closer to me and whether I was going to mess it up. I remember being dropped off like on the reserve playground, wherever my dad happened to be staying at that time, because he moved around a lot, and just being told to go make friends. I remember going to Maui, so powwows when I was young. I remember that stuff, but I also remember, because I didn't grow up with that as like a constant, feeling hesitant or awkward to take part in it. And it was only when I was an adult that I started understanding, my background and my history and why I was disconnected that I start making the actual conscious effort. Because as a kid, you're so afraid of being teased or rejected that because it was different, I was like, well, I don't need that. Like, I have my own friends. I already have family, like, why do I need to do this? Right. So that was definitely fear, as a kid. But yeah, as an adult, I just started kind of reconnecting. I started working at the Friendship Center here in Halifax. I worked for the Atlantic Policy Congress of First Nations Chiefs. I worked for the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, like really making concerted efforts to be connected both professionally and personally by going to community events, showing up to protests, going to powwow, right? Like just doing my best to show up wherever I could. There was an opportunity, I was going to be there.
And was there an event or something that happened that led to you really becoming interested in building that connection and making this effort that you started to make? I'm
trying to think of like when it really became this kind of conscious effort. And I think it stems from a class that I took in university that started talking about things like residential schools, the 60s scoop, generations of kids disconnected. And it was very much like, oh, I think they're talking about me, and that was a really kind of big aha moment. And actually being in class with other Indigenous students, right? Because I went to a huge high school. There's 1,200 kids. There were 2 Indigenous kids, me and my sister. There were, 2 Black kids. And there was one kid who was the, son of Pakistani immigrants. And like, that was it. Like, that was the extent of the diversity. So like, I didn't even have a comfortability around other Indigenous people because I was never around them. And so being, in class, covering subject matter that was so personal and being around other Indigenous students that I could talk it out with, that helped kind of bring me into working and going into community.
I think this is also a really powerful message about it never being too late to reconnect or to connect even for the first time, with your heritage. What you said earlier just about the awkwardness as a child and, that fear of, like you said, doing something wrong or being rejected. I think a lot of us carry that into adulthood. And then you feel as an adult, I missed my chance when I was a kid to connect with my culture. And I really like this message of it. It's not too late. I mean, it's all about really the effort that you choose to put into it.
Yeah. And like, I'm still really awkward. Like, I have friends of mine who are dancers, right? So they're fancy shawl dancers or jingle dress dancers or grass dancers or whatever that may be. And I'll go to a powwow and they'll have intertribal dances where everybody can kind of take part in, whether or not you have regalia, whether or not you're Indigenous. And I remember distinctly that I had a friend of mine who was a dancer, fancy shawl dancer, and she like spotted me in the bleachers, watching, and she comes over and she like pulls me down, and I am just like wanting to melt into the bleachers. Like, please don't pull, like, please. And she pulled me down. She took her shawl off. She put it around my shoulders and she's like, you're out here. You got to do it. And just feeling like nobody cared. Nobody was watching me specifically. And yet I felt like every single eye was on me, so critical, judging every misplaced step or that I would fall off beat or something like that. And then, realizing after the fact, like, it wasn't that bad and it's okay. And I'm still like, I don't think I'll ever be a dancer. That's definitely not my route. But just trying, like, yes, it's going to be really uncomfortable in the moment, but I think it would make, my dad, and I think of like his parents and, my community members proud to see, us trying to relearn that, to like, to come back to culture in that way. I think it would be good for him and for us. And it's probably good for me too.
Absolutely. When you talk about your father in some of your work, you talk about this generational trauma experienced by your family. As your father, of course, as we've said, is a residential school survivor. You also talk about the impact it has had, the impact it continues to have. Mm-hmm. So tell me more about that. How do you still see the effects of that today?
Yeah. So my dad went to residential school. He went to the Shubenacadie Residential School for 5 years. From there, he went down to the United States. He was a homeless youth. He joined the army. He's a Vietnam vet. Like my dad has had a lot of trauma. And the way in which he was able to cope or tried to cope or thought he was coping was through alcohol, you know? So my dad drank a lot. And as a little kid, I didn't understand what that meant. And how that impacted us. And so for me, my birthday is in February, and all of my other siblings' birthdays are in the summer and in the fall. And the way that the cycle of my dad's addiction worked was that he usually would get sober in the summertime, stay sober throughout the fall as best he could, and kind of be around for Christmas. But then as the winter blues would kick in and, you know, work wasn't as prominent or readily available for what he was doing, you know, that's when he would start to drink. And so he would always kind of be involved in my siblings' lives and in at their birthdays and things like that. And he would always promise to be at mine, but he never showed up. And I remember for a very long time, I just believed that he loved me a little less because he was never at my birthday, but he was always at my siblings. And that, even though like I know as an adult now, that's the way addiction works, that was the cycle of his pain. It's still like, I had this conversation with him maybe like a year or two ago. And here I am sitting in, you know, a cafe in Toronto, eating breakfast with him, just trying so hard to keep it together. Like 33 years old at the time or 34 years old at the time, just crying because, you know, as a little girl, Dad, I believed you loved me less. And him kind of feeling gutted over that. But then also, even though we would have these really vulnerable conversations, there are times when we call each other on the phone and we're just kind of awkward. Like we don't necessarily know how to connect. And so that's the impact of gen trauma, is that you can't connect to your kids, you know, you can't connect to your parents, that you're together, but yet you're still very isolated. And that takes effort on both of our parts because, you know, it's awkward. And I think people fear awkwardness more than anything else, you know, in a social setting. And so we're trying, but I also feel like, especially with this pandemic, that my dad's old, he's turning 78 years old. And, you know, even though he got sober almost about 20 or 21 years ago, like I feel like I'm running out of time and I wish I could go see him. I wish I could do more. Right. But, you know, you feel kind of trapped in this. And I think maybe that sense of loss of time is also, you know, a part of that kind of gen trauma and that disconnect. Right. Because I'm trying to like make up for time lost and feeling stuck that I can't. And it's tough. It's hard, you know, trying to work through that and to, you know, make those connections before he's gone.
I just hearing about you having these vulnerable and these tough conversations with him and kind of being able to share the different perspectives that you would have both had on the situation. I mean, I can totally relate to this feeling of running out of time. But I just think it's incredible that you have been able to have those conversations, because so many of these of this history and these stories get lost in families who never get to that point of even having these conversations.
It was about making that decision, you know. I am deciding to know my dad because even though I'm mad, or I was a lot more mad as a child, at least now I have a direction for my anger, and it makes it easier to not be angry with him, but rather angry with the system and the history and the legacy that created such a scenario where you have a parent who just doesn't know how to care for their kid. And so it makes kind of, you know, he still does things that drive me nuts. He still does these things that I find to be really frustrating. Like if I get frustrated with him or he gets frustrated with me, we both kind of slink back to our corners for a couple weeks before we talk again. And that right there is an impact of like not knowing how to talk through strong emotions with one another. Because I can do that with my husband, you know, him and I can sit down and say, this is what's bothering me, or this is what's frustrating, let's work through it. But it, like, trying to do that with my dad, neither of us know really where to start and like how hard we can push. And so, you know, we're still getting to know each other, right? And I think that's part of it, is that the getting to know of your kid and your parent happens over a lifetime. But here we are starting as adults trying to get to know each other. and it can be challenging at times. It doesn't take away from the fact that I'm so incredibly proud of him, for having, beat his addiction so effectively in the way that he has. Not a lot of people can say that, right? That he does continue to call me, even though I'm sure out of all of his kids, I'm probably like sometimes the most frustrating. I know that I'm a very stubborn person, and I certainly get that from him. So seeing those similarities too in our personalities is like, those are things that I love. I just wish somehow we could figure out sometimes how to get around all of those walls and all of those barriers that both of us have put up to protect ourselves, but not necessarily understanding how to take them down because they prevent us from getting to know each other a lot better.
Yeah, and through these conversations that, it sounds like you have together made a lot of progress in sharing a little bit more, probably each time you have one of those vulnerable conversations. But I understand what you're saying too about putting up those walls, and of course, that is self-preservation and wanting to protect yourself from any hurt, and especially when there has been a lot of past trauma there. Does your dad speak at all about his experience in the residential school system?
He does. From time to time, he'll talk about it. He'll have stories. I make a habit of, whenever we do talk, I'll turn the recording on my phone on and I'll just set it on the table, and he'll just talk. And I have a lot of his stories recorded. He has a very, very deep voice. Because he kind of grew up from the age of like 10 to 20 in Harlem, New York. He has a little bit of a New York accent, which is kind of fun. And it's a way that I can kind of capture his stories, so that if I ever have to write about them, or I want to write about them, I can go back to do them justice. And it's also a way of capturing his memory, because I do recognize that he's not going to be around forever, and that we do live very far apart. And I think that grieving that even before it happens is something that I'm trying not to do, to like worry about. Like, I want to be appreciative of the moment that we're in. But as somebody who is an anxious person, you're always trying to prepare for the worst, right? So it's a way in which I'm trying to, I think, maybe capture his memory as well. He's probably he'll watch this and be like, "Child," he's like, "I'm not dead yet." But that's it. Like that's the worry and the over preparedness is, like a symptom of, or an outcome of, a kid growing up, in a not healthy environment. So we're doing the best we can we're putting our broken pieces back together, but the cracks are still visible.
What a great idea to record those conversations. Like that is so smart. And yeah, no matter, whether, no matter what happens, I think you will always be happy that you have those recordings too. And speaking of recordings, actually, I was going back and doing a little deep dive on you on the good old internet, and I found quite a few of your old performances, some from those really early days, and some a little more recent, and it was very powerful and very, I felt like I could kind of go on a bit of a journey with you as your career has grown, as you have talked about different subjects through your spoken word. And I wondered, as we're talking about this relationship with your father and your poetry, how much did your poetry help you to process some of these difficulties that were happening with you along the way?
I would say they helped a lot. It was a way that I could like learn my history and like weave that history and that information and knowledge into my words, and then react to that history in those. And so I have this poem about my dad, and it's called An Indian Called Sir. And he used to be he's like, "Don't call me Mr. Thomas, don't call me sir." And I said, "No, like that, you've earned that title. Like that is a title of respect." And I kind of wrote in that, like what it was like having him as a dad, whether it be through like the various girlfriends that he had, not all of them that I liked. And like, what was that like for me as a young kid, as a young woman, that experience, and what it was like when he wouldn't show up to my birthday or to something that was important to me, and how that impacted me. Like, I have letters. It's very interesting. I have handwritten letters from my dad that he would have posted during the time that he was drinking, and who you could tell like he didn't want to let me down, but they would be like these weird offshoots that made no sense, like these tangents, and he would write them to me. And I talk about those letters in this poem, or I allude to them, like just handwritten notes that are like, he's just trying to be lighthearted and silly because he's avoiding, upsetting me or breaking my heart, And I remember there was one time he showed up, like, because that's the thing, when you grow up, like a lot of my friends had divorced parents, but they knew who their parents were. And I knew who their parents were. And here I was like trying to talk to my friends about my dad, and they're like, but then him never being around. And then one day was my birthday and he showed up, and I was like shocked. Like I didn't know. Yeah, I was kind of a little in disbelief, like, oh my God, like my dad's here, and like so excited to like introduce him to all my friends and, all that sort of stuff. And then I remember that like that day, like in that evening, like it didn't end up going well. Like he like said like, oh, you can kind of trying to convince my mom to like let me and my older sister like stay with him, at his hotel for overnight. It'll be fun. It'll be a great sleepover. And then like he left, and like I remember waking up at like 2 a.m. and my dad wasn't there, and like calling my mom and being like, I don't know where my dad is, and like understand like now as an adult. It's like he was struggling, and he was doing the very best he could, and he had the most amazing intentions to really give me something that I craved, like like just time hanging out with my dad, and then not necessarily being able to do both, like to struggle, to cope, and to parent all at the same time. Like something had to give. And so there's these moments and these memories, and I talk about that in this poem about like the highs and lows of having a parent that you love, but also being really frustrated that they can't seem to love you the way you need it,
Yeah. And I really appreciate the kind of raw honesty there, but also the empathy that you approach the situation with now, because I think that it's very easy to let that resentment kind of fester and really be the dominant emotion in those situations. So I think that being able to have that empathy at this point, and and of course over the years as you have worked through some of these topics with him and through your poetry, I like that that's kind of the overwhelming sentiment now is this sense of empathy and understanding for what he's been through.
Yeah, like I think about how I'm, to be very cliche, like I'm still working on myself and I happen to have a very good job that has benefits, that pay for a therapist, that I have a spouse who's incredibly supportive, who's always there if I need it, that I live in a day and age where we're talking about mental health is like, becoming less stigmatized. It's still there. But here you have this man, this Indigenous Mi'kmaq man in his late 70s, at that time, men didn't have mental health issues. You had to be able to deal with it and like to struggle through and to do it in such silence. And things like PTSD did not exist. Like the concept of that trauma, like childhood trauma and how that carries forward, those concepts didn't exist. So like I count myself being very privileged that I'm able to like openly and honestly work through my traumas and my experiences with the support of community and friends and family. Whereas I can only imagine how much help my dad might have needed, but would have no idea how to ask for it, no resources to get the support that he needed. And that, at the time, like there weren't a lot of Indigenous doctors, like all this sort of stuff. So to be treated by somebody who would look down on him because of his race, right? If he got treated. So like, I understand. It doesn't, you can see on the other side too, it's like he was an adult and I was a kid, and that, I shouldn't have to look after my parent. But at the same time, you have to have empathy. You have to try to understand where this person is coming from. I think it's helped in some of my relationships for sure, but it's still a challenge.
Yeah, I think that message of having empathy and kind of approaching every situation with empathy, knowing we kind of never know all the facts of what someone else has been through. I think that's a really powerful message that we can all really apply to our own relationships during this time, especially during this time when things have become so challenging for so many of us. Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about your time as the Poet Laureate in Halifax, because this really happened just a few years after your turning point, after that first time you got on stage. So what was it like being the poet laureate? And, tell us a little bit more about, I feel like this is kind of a very niche position that most people don't know a lot about. So tell us about your time doing that.
Yeah, I didn't ever think that I was going to be a poet laureate. By no means. This was my first kind of artist application to anything. And so I was like, oh, well, it's a good exercise, right? To put together stuff. So I did, and I went in, and I interviewed, and I did a performance, and et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't really think much of it. And then I got a phone call from Jamie McClellan, who is the person who's in charge of the Poet Laureate program in Halifax. And he said, yeah, I'd like to discuss, we should have a meeting, so and so forth. And I was like, sorry, okay, so excuse me, come again? And he's like, oh, yeah, I sent an email, but he was calling like Friday, and he must have sent it later in the day, and I hadn't gotten it. And he's like, yeah, congratulations, you got the position. And I was totally blown away. And so after my kind of initial shock wore off, I had such a great mentor in Elle Jones, whether she was intentionally mentoring me or me just kind of admiring her so much, to see how she had turned that role into this kind of city-sanctioned advocacy position. And I really wanted to do that for my own community. I was really starting to get my feet underneath me when it came to speaking about Indigenous issues, certain contexts. And so I kind of, I did the same thing, and I ran with it. And within that position, I managed to get the Cornwallis statue taken down and some other things and challenge it. I also, I'm sure, on one side of the coin, I'm sure I became a little bit of like, a Halifax darling. But on the other side of that coin, I know that there were organizations and publications that did not like me and would do things that were quite rude and racist and sexist, would cover me in those ways. But it was this very interesting position where I felt like I got to run my mouth and it was fine. And I had never had that before. My mom used to always tell me that like words would go out my mouth before they went through my brain. And here I was making like somewhat of a career of doing that. And it was definitely the beginning of my outspokenness for sure.
That I love that. I mean, I love that it kind of gave you this platform for, for activism and for really bringing some of your ideas to the forefront of the city. And I think a lot of people during that time, I remember when the controversy and the discussions over the Cornwallis statue were happening. I mean, those are conversations that were not really being had there until you came along and really brought them to the forefront of city issues.
Yeah, and I didn't intend to do that. It wasn't an intention at all. Part of the Poet Laureate position is that you have to read in council in April, which is National Poetry Month. And I had this poem, this like kind of like personal poem about like figuring myself out, very navel gazing, I'm sure. And then I was about to go into city chambers or council chambers, and I turned to Jamie and I turned to his boss, and I said, I'm not going to do that poem. I'm going to do a different poem instead. And I walked in and I did that Cornwallis poem, and I was so nervous. And I think the nervous level was equivalent to that of the first time I was on stage. But then I felt in that moment, I had a responsibility and an obligation to my community. Not very many Mi'kmaq people had access to the entire council of a major city that makes decisions, right, that affect that community. So I just felt it as a responsibility to do it.
Yeah, wow. And you did. And to see the impact of your work like that, I mean, what did that part of it feel like? Because, in the beginning, you talked about that first time you got on stage, being really nervous, clutching your notebook. And now fast forward a few years later, you're the Poet Laureate in Halifax. You have this stage, you actually see these changes happening because of your work. What did that do for your kind of your confidence and I guess your sense of purpose?
I think you see like that pendulum swing happen. So when I first started doing that, when I first became Poet Laureate, I said yes to absolutely everything. Part of it was kind of like cutting my teeth on being an activist, a performer, a writer, because I didn't have barely any experience or practice in writing or performing, really. Like, I have a theater minor, but that's done within the safety of your university classroom. And so it was me like trying to hone my craft, develop myself as a performer and as an artist. And I ended up definitely burning out, for sure, because I said yes to absolutely everything. I didn't necessarily know my worth or my value. So there were certainly instances in which organizations didn't pay me or compensate me adequately when they could have, and then put a big ask on me. And so in that process of being poet laureate, I went from the say yes to everything. And then towards the end of that, and then the few years after being poet laureate, I learned that I didn't have to say yes to everything, that it was okay if I didn't feel great about a project, that I could not do it. And so now where I am, and I've been incredibly lucky through my publishing and through publicity and opportunities like this one, that I have been able to pick and choose what I find I'm passionate about and what I find worthwhile, and learning my worth as an artist. So that, we have the saying in like many of the artists community, and it's like when people say, you'll get great exposure, we talk about how the artist died from exposure, because, you can't eat, oh, my rent is exactly 800 exposures. Thank you, And so here I am, lucky enough that I have a job, but I also have a responsibility to set an expectation of other artists who want to do, writing and performing as their main form of income. So, I do set that bar because it's important that other artists are able to get compensation fairly. And that's where this kind of, I guess, evolution of my performance is, like just knowing my worth and having the confidence to say, no, I'm not interested in that. And I have the privilege to say no to low payment or to no payment because I have a job. But I think it's a really important thing that doesn't get talked about a lot, is that a lot of people want artists to do things for free, and that's not okay.
Yeah, and the way you quantified that with the exposures there, you're right. I mean, exposure is not what is going to pay your bills, and also that piece about doing projects and agreeing to engagements that really resonate with you. I totally like. I think that it's something, and like I know you said, you have you were in a position where you have the privilege of being able to do that, but that is something that's so hard for so many artists too. Is you are thinking about being able to pay your bills and then trying to balance this. Accepting things that maybe you don't really want to do, but that are going to pay the bills. It's a really tough balance to strike. I imagine you still get a lot of offers for speaking engagements, for publishing. One of the first ones, or the first books I should say that you published, is called "I'm Finding My Talk." How would you describe that one for anyone who hasn't read it yet?
Ooh, well, that one's like very near and dear to my heart. That one has like a special context. I would have done that for free. I would have paid to do that. So I'm Finding My Talk is the companion piece or the response piece to Rita Joe's I Lost My Talk. And for anyone who doesn't know who Rita Joe is, she was this iconic Mi'kmaq poet. She was, I would say, one of like the big trailblazers when it came to speaking earnestly and emotionally about her experience in residential school. She went to the same residential school that my father went to. And she wrote this iconic poem, I Lost My Talk, about just like losing her language, but not just her language, along with her language, her worldview. Like she talks about how like, I think like you, I create like you, the scrambled ballad about my words, about like how, she got turned, or her culture was taken away, not only like the physical culture of like the way she dressed or the way she spoke, but to how she thought and how she created. And at the very end of it, which she talks about how, so gently I offer my hand, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me. And that has always been such a driver and inspiration for how I write. I am incredibly critical in how I write, and I talk about some very difficult things. But for me, I feel like I need to offer, like I will knock you down with one hand and I will help you up with the other. And the way Rita Jo did that with her work has inspired how I write and how I view my writing and my responsibility. So when Nimbus was turning I Lost My Talk into a children's book, they connected with me. They reached out and they said, well, we would like you to write the response piece. And absolutely, yes, 100%. What a huge honor. And it was only after that I had agreed to do that that I started getting extremely nervous and very overwhelmed, because it was such an iconic poem and such an incredible woman that I needed to then do justice to. And I had never met her family. I'd never met her. What if they didn't like it? Oh my God, maybe I should reconsider. But I wrote, I'm finding my talk, just about my process of reclaiming, and even though I'm putting it together a puzzle and I'm missing a lot of pieces, I'm still trying, right? And that's how I wrote I'm Finding My Talk. And Rita Jo's children loved it. I had an opportunity to read and recite Rita Jo's poetry along with her family at an event earlier in 2020. And it was just, it was an incredible experience. So that, I feel like I had that big, long, soapbox about knowing my worth and asking for the right amount of money. And here I am talking about how I would have paid to do I'm Finding My Talk, because it holds such a special place in my heart.
Well, and that's important too, balancing the work you get paid for and balancing the work that you're passionate about. And I did actually read online not a review, but I guess a comment from one of her children about how pleased they were and how perfect the I Found My Talk was to her original piece. So it's really beautiful just to hear what was happening behind the scenes and how special that was for you too. And it was your first publication, or your first published book, but you have also more recently published a book called Swift Fox All Along, also a children's book, and this one is based on your own experiences. So how did this one come to be? And I guess I wondered if you had always intended it to be a children's book, or if there was any conversation about the format that you were going to tell this story in.
It had started off as a poem. I am so incredibly lucky. I have to kind of go back and say that all of my publishing has been publishing houses reaching out to me saying, we really want to publish your stuff. So sometimes I get asked for publishing advice and I feel wholly unqualified to answer, because I have been so phenomenally lucky. So Anik Press, which is one of the largest children's book producers and publishers in North America, reached out to me and they said, we would really do you have an idea? Do you have a concept? Whatever, we will publish it. And so I sent them this poem that I had written for a different project, but then it didn't get used. And I had sent that to them and they're like, cool, we really like the idea, but we want to zoom in on these 4 lines, but then you got to take those 4 lines and turn it into a children's book. And so then I had written a rhyming prose children's book, very similar to that of I'm Finding My Talk. And they were like, yeah, this is great. We love the concept, but rewrite it. We don't want it to rhyme. And so then I had to rewrite it again. And oh my goodness, the amount of time that went into editing this piece. And most children's books have very strict word and page counts. And so it was 2 years of editing for a children's book that turned out to be something like 750, 800 words, maybe 900 words. But it was such an interesting process for me in trying to understand and shift my craft, because I'm very descriptive in my words. And time again, my editor, Mary Beth, she's wonderful. If you're ever watching this, Mary Beth, thank you for your patience. Said you don't need to describe that. We'll have an illustrator. They can draw it. You have to talk about feelings and put dialogue in there, emotions, right? And so that was really challenging because I had to change the way that I wrote entirely. But I think it worked out really well, the children's book, because it was about a child experiencing something for the very first time and all those extreme emotions that kids can feel, extreme nervousness, extreme sadness, joy, stuff that I think sometimes as adults gets muted. So it worked out really, really well as a children's book. And I was very strict about who I wanted to illustrate it. I said I want it to be an Indigenous person. I want them to be, if possible, a woman or a queer person. And we ended up finding this wonderful, wonderful artist, Maya McGibbon, who they just created something spectacular. They managed to capture Swift Fox's energy perfectly. And so I'm so proud of that book. I just love it so much. I love the illustrations. I love the story. So yeah, I'm very, very thrilled with how that turned out.
Oh, that's it's very cool to hear about this process that you went through of creating it, because of course your writing would be so different when you're writing for your spoken word performances, or when you're writing poetry that you imagine, people will be reading without illustration. So yeah, that whole idea of taking some of the description out and letting the pictures tell a story. That's very cool. And I love the book. I mean, I know it's a children's book, but I think adults can also really enjoy it and learn something from it too. I do want to touch on one other thing you said there, because you said you were, very lucky that these publishing houses have come to you. But I do want to point out that you are extremely hardworking. Aside from being very talented and gifted at what you do, you are very hardworking. In fact, in our pre-interview call, we were just chatting a little bit about, we talked about what we were going to talk about today. But then at the end, I said, and what are you up to now? And you started by saying, well, I'm actually taking some time for myself. And then you listed off, I think, about 10 projects that you were actually working on. So I think that all of that hard work is a testament to your success. So I just wanted to give you a lot of credit there, and say that, maybe some of it, there's a little bit of luck in there, but I think most of that is just really a testament to all of your hard work and effort.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I think sometimes it's a coping mechanism in of itself, right? If I can work hard enough, if I can earn enough, if I can be prestigious enough, then I will be worthy of safety and love and all those things that I worried about as a kid. So, thank you for that. I also struggle sometimes being even if I never published another thing or wrote another poem, I'm still deserving of all of those things. And it's a battle, but I appreciate it. I do work hard, but it doesn't necessarily feel like it's hard. It feels like what else would I be doing? There's a little bit of that to it.
Well, that's a good thing too, because you're very passionate about what you do. And I actually, now I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, because I know it's not always the easiest thing for us to talk about our own accomplishments. And but it's been 8 years, only 8 years since that first time you got on stage. You have done so much in that time. We talked about your publications. We talked about your being the poet laureate in Halifax. What are you most proud of that has happened since that time that you've accomplished?
Oh dear. I think I'm the most proud of the positive impacts that have happened in my community based off of the work that I have done. So seeing the Cornwallis statue come down and how that kind of created a little bit of a domino effect across Canada, where statues of Sir John A., right, Wilfrid Laurier, whatever, there was people were maybe we shouldn't have these things here, right? To see that happen and the positive impact that has had on Indigenous Canadians' sense of belonging in our own territories, right? It's not about feeling like we belong in Canada. These are our territories. Of course we belong here. So seeing that positive impact, and I'm really, really proud of seeing little Mi'kmaq kids see stories about themselves and getting excited about it. I did this Zoom classroom visit with kids, and they were so excited that I was there. And this one little Mi'kmaq girl who, she was very shy, and she came up to the computer. She took off her mask, because they have to wear masks in the classroom, so she could read me her question. And she said, how's the question? She said, were you afraid of what white people would think when you wrote your lines? By the way, I'm really glad that you wrote them. And it was I was don't start crying. Don't start crying. Just to that's what I'm so proud of. I do have awards And like, this isn't like a false modesty thing. Like I feel kind of embarrassed to like display them, because I feel like those awards aren't what's important. It's like that little girl who's like, I'm so glad that you said those things. Right. Like, and so like I have like an award that's like a vase that I just keep my pens in, it's on like, it's on my desk. Right. I have another award that's like tilted at the back of a shelf that's collecting dust. Like, those aren't the things that I'm really proud of. I'm appreciative that people can recognize the work that I do as merit, but it's more so the impact that I have on like youth and Indigenous communities. Like that's what I will remember. I got a bunch of handwritten cards, thank you cards from a class from around like Millbrook and Sabaganagity, of like kids saying like, thank you so much for coming. Like, I want to be a writer when I grow up, like that sort of stuff. Oh, those are the ones that like make me like want to cry, with gratitude. That's what I'm proud of, for sure.
Oh, that story. Yeah. Geez, I'm tearing up over here just hearing that. But I think that sums up so beautifully the impact of your work, because in the news stories and articles, you will hear about some of those milestones, about the statues, and but just knowing that your stories are having an impact on little kids and changing the way they see the world and maybe what they can do when they grow up, that I can't think of a better impact, a better legacy. So that's so beautiful. And thank you so much for sharing all of this today. I know we talked about some really personal parts of your life. I really appreciate you being so willing to share that with myself and with everyone who's watching and listening.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Just kind of like on that one last piece, I think it's important to have like not only like Indigenous role models, but like accessible Indigenous role models. Because I remember I use it in a lot of my lectures or kind of speaking gigs. There's this picture of me as a little girl, and I'm opening up a Christmas present, and it is a Pocahontas pottery wheel. And I remember when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I dressed up as Pocahontas for Halloween, because one, like, that's not okay. Like, that's not my nation, like not my culture. And that's a complete like horrendous retelling and lies of like the Pocahontas story. But that was the only mainstream accessible Indigenous person that as a little girl I saw, because Pocahontas in that Disney cartoon looked like my older sisters, Treva and Lauren, right? Like, so, oh my gosh, like what? Like, somebody who looks like my family. And then being very crestfallen, obviously, when I was an adult and I learned the real story of Pocahontas. And so being like an accessible, like real live Indigenous mentor is something that I think I take very seriously. And so trying to own up to all of that, like learning and stumbling and figuring out who you are. And it's okay if you don't know right now, and it's a process, is really important, because that's something that I did not have as a kid, right? Especially like women too, like not having accessible like women who looked like you, sounded like you, went through things that you went through, right? So that was just, for me, that was just like going on back to that like kind of accomplishment piece, or what I'm the most proud of, is trying to make myself accessible to youth, so that they themselves can, I don't know, find something in me in hopes that they can then be something else that somebody else will see something in, right? Like, and kind of break that generational trauma and kind of create like generational like admiration or accomplishment or courage or something, right? A new generational something that's positive.
Yes, I love that idea. Generational accomplishment and pride, I think too, as you have shown through your work and discovering so much about your Mi'kmaq heritage that you then are sharing with people from Indigenous backgrounds and also non-Indigenous people too. I think have learned so much about your culture. Thanks to you being so willing to share and to let us make some mistakes along the way to and to learn from them. though,
Yeah.
you know, being able to learn obviously is such a big piece of this. So I thank you for that. Personally, I have learned so much, and I think it has given me a better understanding too of some of these concepts like generational trauma and the lingering impacts of the residential school system. You know, you have done so much with all of these different positions with your written work in 8 years, and I have no doubt you will continue to do exactly what you just said there. So I really look forward to following your career and to seeing what's next for you. But I do hope you get some downtime, some actual downtime somewhere in there too.
I hope so. I want to be able to like go on a vacation again. That would be nice.
Yes. Yeah. 2021 goals right there.
Mm-hmm. And I really want to see my dad. I miss my family very much. And, you know, I'm the only one that's here. We're all over the globe. So I think, you know, step 1 would be to safely visit my father. Step 2, safely visit my sister. You know, those would be some big goals on my part.
I really hope that you get to do that this year. And hopefully, you know, somewhere along the way, we'll get to meet up in person again, too.
Yeah, that would be lovely.
All right. Thanks again, Rebecca. I really appreciate you making time for me today.
Well, Alan, thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to all of you who have been watching and listening. I would love to hear your thoughts. Please feel free to find my email address on our website, priyasam.com. And we hope you'll turn in next week for another episode of Turning Point. Until then, please take good care of yourself and of each other.